about today are basically three things. One is, what are the basics of human rights? What does it mean, human rights? Secondly, what is the link between businesses and human rights? And thirdly, as Alyssa mentioned, I want to speak about the specific project that I work on, ranking digital rights. Just to introduce myself, my name is Alon Ba, and I'm the Policy and Engagement Manager of Ranking Digital Rights. And I'm also a visiting fellow here in Berlin with Stiftung Neue Verantwortung. So let's just jump to the first slide, if the slide thing jumps. Let's see. Is there another thing that should do?
Okay, I'll advance for you.
Yeah. All right. So the first question I have on here is, what are human rights? So I thought, rather than giving you a specific definition of what is understood as human rights in international legal terms or something like that, I'd ask you here in the audience what you think are human rights, or maybe to put it differently, what do you believe are things that every human being around the world, regardless of their nationality, their religion, the color of their skin, etc., should be entitled to? Do any of you have examples that you'd like to give? Yes, please.
Gotta go to the mic. You gotta go to the mic.
I'll be happy to say it here, otherwise it will be difficult for everyone to come up.
That's true. Charles from Vienna. Yeah, being treated the same regardless of nationality, religion, gender, etc., etc., in a legal and societal sense.
Great. So it includes the right not to be discriminated against. Any other examples? Feel free to say things from the room. I'll be happy to say it here on the mic. You don't have to walk up. Perhaps things like the right not to be tortured. Maybe that's something we can all agree on. That would be great if everyone in the world has that right. Or the right to live. Or the right to have security. So human rights can entail all sorts of things. In the context of the internet, other rights that we often hear about are the right to freedom of expression, or the right to privacy, or the right to freedom of association even. So there are many examples of things that people are thinking about when they think, okay, what is it that every human being should have? In other contexts also speak about things like the right to education, the right to work, the right to own property. So there are many goals or many rights or many basics that every human being should have, and that are commonly understood to be human rights. Now, what is the genesis of human rights exactly? To my sense, the term human rights has become very popular, especially over the last few decades. So how has it come about? Human rights especially gained notion shortly after the Second World War, when, with the establishment of the United Nations and the United Nations Charter establishing human rights as something to strive for, there was an understanding that there need to be actions, there needed to be some sort of instrument to guard against the horrors that people experienced during the Second World War specifically, and also other horrors that happened in the world, obviously in centuries and many millennia before that. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted as the first clear document outlining what human rights should be. 2 decades later, there were treaties formed between governments that agreed with each other on these are the sort of things that we want to protect every human being around the world on. These are the rights that every individual should have. And these were both civil and political rights, but these were also rights that went in the direction of cultural, economic, and social rights. In the decades after, human rights gained much more traction, and to my belief, this is partly because words that were used in the past, such as social justice, to advance for a cause, and that rallied people around certain causes, were replaced by the more specific instruments and more specific ways that people could try to gain justice, try to strive for that social justice in the human rights, which made it more tangible and which made it a more clear instrument that they could hold the state accountable with. Can we show the next slide, please? So at the same time, I think the reality is that human rights are not universally respected. I think we can all think of examples where we've seen that human rights are violated or individuals' human rights are at risk. There's torture and killing going on in Syria. There's crackdown on human rights defenders in China. In the United States, there's mass surveillance program, or there has a mass surveillance program going on. In Zimbabwe, the internet is being shut down. In Turkey, newspapers are closed. So there are many such examples where we see that human rights are under threat. So even though we said, well, every human being should have these rights, in reality, we see that across the world, there are many examples where human rights are not protected and not respected. Next slide, please. So I was just giving all sorts of examples of states, right? States violating human rights. And traditionally, people have always thought about the states as the main violator, but also as the main protector for human rights. The states would be the ones responsible for making sure that individuals have their rights respected. At the same time, business and human rights is a link that we've seen coming up more and more. I'm wondering if any of you have any ideas in mind of how a business, how an organization as such can affect individuals' human rights. Please.
Charles again. So making access to the business's services available on a discriminatory basis, providing information about people that allows other organizations or aids other organizations to infringe on their human rights. So exposing people to a human rights violation through your business practice. And just straight out taking away people's rights.
Great, thank you.
Going and steam bulldozing their houses and stuff.
Right. Yeah, so these are all very good examples, absolutely. Other examples that we can think of are supply chain issues. For example, when a business uses child labor, or when a company hires private or government security guards to crack down on demonstration outside of their factory. So business can be involved in human rights violations in many different ways. In recognition of that, next slide please, there has been something called the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So I'm not presenting that with a big rainbow through it as this is the solution to everything and all human rights will now be respected by states and businesses alike. But I'm presenting it because this is one very concrete avenue by which different actors, meaning states, civil society, others have come together, including businesses, to say, what should the standards be when we think about human rights and how we should respect them? And how can we consider these sort of standards? Next slide, please. So the United Nations Guiding Principles consist of 3 pillars. The first one is the state duty to protect human rights. So that is sort of the clear standard that needs to be set in stone, meaning the state has the primary responsibility. They're the ones that need to make sure that inhabitants in their territory have their rights protected. Next slide, please. Secondly, there's a corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So it can't all be on the states. Corporations also need to think very clearly about what kind of role they play, how they may affect human rights, what kind of decisions they should make accordingly, and try to find resolve to make sure that human rights risks are being mitigated. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the third pillar, which is both should provide access to remedy. Meaning, if an individual finds their rights being violated, either by the state or by corporation or by cooperation between the two, there should be some sort of way for them to say, I need to have a redress for what has happened here. I need to be able to either go to a court or file a complaint within the company, or have some sort of instrument, some sort of mechanism to say, I need to have my right respected, and I want to address what has happened, and I need to seek a resolution to this. So both states and corporations have a responsibility to provide access to remedy. Next slide. Going from the more basics of what human rights are, what the responsibility of business are, I want to touch on the very specific framework that I work on called Ranking Digital Rights, and how we look at that role of businesses in the ICT sector vis-a-vis human rights. With Ranking Digital Rights, we released the Corporate Accountability Index, which focuses on the world's largest technology companies on how they deal with 2 very specific human rights, the right to privacy and the right to freedom of expression. And we rank companies based on these rights and based on a methodology that looks at these rights. Next slide, please. So we do two things. First is we set standards, meaning it's very difficult to make any sort of meaningful measurement or assessment of what technology companies are doing before being able to say, this is what the behavior should look like. So that's the first step. So establishing what the standards should be for companies as they consider their human rights practices. Secondly is we're measuring how companies are performing based on these standards. And on the basis of that, we're releasing an index with results for the companies that we assess. Next slide, please. The 2015 Corporate Accountability Index that we released in November of last year looked at 16 companies, 8 internet companies and 8 telecommunications companies. We assessed them based on 31 indicators in categories of commitment, which means sort of the overall governance structure of companies and how they deal with human rights. And then the categories of freedom of expression and privacy. As mentioned, we looked at 31 indicators. Next slide, please. And could you click further? And even further. So yes, there was an animation of sorts included here, as you may see. These are the companies that we assessed. So basically globally operating companies, the companies that are in red, I believe, and are the internet companies that are in green. I'm a bit colorblind. Is that green? Or is that yellow? Green? Green. Okay, let's go with that. Thank you. In green are the telecommunications companies that we assessed. And all these companies together have users around the world. So we're just focusing here on sort of put a star in their headquarter location, but they have users around the world. Next slide, please. So the main results I just want to very briefly highlight here of the index were that most users are in the dark in terms of how users' rights are being treated, meaning even the top performing company only scored 65 out of the possible 100 points that they could get in the index. And many companies scored much further, sometimes even the low teens even, so they only scored 12%, let's say, of the 100% that they could score on the answers that we look for. There still is a range between companies, and for all companies, there is a clear pathway to improve. So the index that we have released is not meant sort of as a tomato to be thrown at companies, but as a very helpful instrument for companies to make sure that they can do better on how they respect users' rights. Next slide, please. Two very brief examples that I want to show you from our results of specific indicators that we looked at. One are on human rights impact assessments. As I mentioned before, in terms of the UN guiding principles on business human rights, one of the things that the guiding principles are asking for is for corporations to very clearly think through how they might impact the rights of their users. In order to do that, they can do human rights impact assessments or do corporate due diligence, meaning they should have a very clear audit on how the products and services might impact the users. For example, if a telecommunications company is entering a new market, they might want to consider how they might be involved with state surveillance while they are in that new market. Right? Will they be forced by intelligence agencies to hand over user data? Will they be forced to install equipment into their server space, etc.? Or for the current products and services that they have, for an internet company, for example, is there some sort of inherent mechanism in there that might put users at risk? So all these sort of questions are very important for companies to consider and to keep considering as they run their operations to make sure their users' rights are being respected. As you can see in the results, there's a wide range between performance of companies. The top performing company here scored almost 90% in terms of having such a process and disclosing that they have such a process. Quite a few companies, I believe half the companies scored 0% on this. So either they don't do such a thing or they're being conspicuously silent about it. Next slide, please. Another indicator to highlight is on grievance and remedy. As I mentioned before, that third pillar of the UN guiding principles looks at this specifically, asking for having access to remedy. Most companies are performing very poorly on this. The top performing companies scored only 50%. Most companies score somewhere around 20% or even lower, which means that they may have a form on their website, or sorry, an email address on the website that says, if you have a question about a privacy policy, send an email to this address. But no clear procedure, no clear complaint mechanism, no explanation what they do in such circumstances as they receive a complaint or what they do to find a resolution. Next slide, please. So these were just some examples that I wanted to highlight from the Rank Related Rights Index, but more broadly that I want to tie into the broader framework of human rights and human rights in business, and how such a thing can be concretely implemented in the form of an assessment framework of corporations. I believe that we'll do Q&A later, is that right, Alyssa?
Yeah, so if people have clarifying questions for Alon, then we can take them now, but we'll have time for group Q&A at the end. So any clarifying questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.
All right. Come on up and introduce yourself since I don't have your bio in front of me.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Motoko Aizawa, and I'm with the Institute for Human Rights in Business. We are a small but global think tank that explores the relationship between business and international human rights instruments. I am a recovering lawyer. I don't know whether there's such thing as a recovering engineer, but I'm certainly not a practicing lawyer, but my background is business law. And I spent 2 decades within the World Bank Group looking at all sorts of sustainability challenges, and worked very closely with John Ruggie, who was the instigator and the drafter of the UN Guiding Principles that you just heard about. So I just want to start by framing the conversation and to share a little story. This year is the 5th year anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles. We just celebrated in June the 5th year anniversary with John Ruggie. And I got to ask John, what surprised you most 5 years hence from the unanimous approval, endorsement of the guiding principles by the UN Human Rights Council? What did you expect and what surprised you most? So John said, well, there are a lot of things that I didn't expect. But one thing that really took me by surprise is that organizations beyond the major multinationals, the extractive industries, apparel industries, the villains that you usually think about in the business and human rights context, actually the UN Guiding Principles seeped and went well beyond them. So he said, I never would have imagined that organizations like FIFA, which you are familiar with, and I'm sure you're familiar with all sorts of their corruption scandal, but FIFA actually went ahead and worked with John Ruggie to put in place a human rights policy to deal with the lack of all sorts of considerations in their decision-making process. He said, I never would have imagined organizations like FIFA would get there. FIFA, by the way, is a Swiss nonprofit. So technically outside the purview of the UN Guiding Principles, perhaps, because the guiding principles apply to business enterprises. But on the other hand, FIFA is run like a business. And you could say, in fact, their operations are business. In addition to FIFA, I can also tell you the International Bar Association, the American Bar Association, different national bar associations, regional organizations, they're all grappling with this challenge. Accountants, stock exchanges, trade associations. So this conversation is spilling into all arenas outside of the most immediate stakeholder groups that the business and human rights movement was meant to address. And even ICANN is having that conversation, as I will come to momentarily. So next slide, please. So the point of this is that there are many organizations that face business and human rights, or straightforward human rights challenges and dilemmas, and that they have many different ways to deal with that particular challenge. So multiple pathways, multiple destinations, yeah? And this is the fascinating thing about observing how the UN Guiding Principles are used by these different organizations. And so I just want to give you a sense of how that process works and how my organization is helping facilitate that conversation and helping the decision-making processes of different organizations, taking into account a lot of the issues are new. Never thought of the ICT sector having all sorts of human rights issues, but now you just heard from Alon, there are all these issues that are coming up that are being expressed in human rights terms. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that we did after the UN guiding principles was to work on certain sectors that perhaps needed more detailed guidance on how to apply the UN guiding principles. And we were requested by the European Commission to come up with 3 sector guides. So we did one on oil and gas, one on employment agencies, and the third one for the ICT sector. This is a joint project that we did with another organization called SHIFT. And basically this was the sort of UNGP's one-on-one for the ICT sector. And basically the nutshell of it is, look, there are common due diligence steps that you could take to understand the human rights impacts of your organizations and to address them. So what are the 6 steps? To have a human rights policy, to assess the human rights impacts of that particular organization. If there are negative impacts, first to prevent, and second to mitigate those impacts, to monitor and track your performance over time, to communicate to your stakeholders what you are doing, and to remedy, to the extent there are negative impacts, to address those negative impacts through a grievance mechanisms. So those are the key steps, and those are the backbone of a human rights impact assessment, which is a method of inquiry and analysis that we usually ask companies to take on board to address these challenges. So moving on. Now, the next example is to take this process to a much more specific situation with Tech UK. This is the work that we did following the Arab Spring discoveries that a bunch of countries were using cybersecurity products and services to actually basically conduct mass surveillance with dire consequences for human rights advocacy groups and writers and bloggers who got arrested and detained. So the UK government said, look, this is an industry that is very important to us because it's a major source of jobs and revenue. At the same time, we consider that this industry could create reputational risks for themselves, but also to the country as a whole. And as a result, we want to come up with some guidance on how cybersecurity firms can incorporate human rights considerations when they export their products and services. So again, there are some basic steps that this guide recommends. Understand what your product or services could do, how it could be abused. Understand the country background in terms of their laws, their frameworks, their human rights track records, whether they're vulnerable groups, and to think about what you could do vis-a-vis the end use, the purchaser of that exported products, and to come up with some mitigating mechanisms, including having contractual provisions when you actually do export and sell your products. And so this is basically to address these bunch of risks that have been identified from a human rights point of view, and to reduce those as much as possible. So what are the human rights risks that this particular guide tried to address? They are privacy, right to freedom of assembly, association, freedom of expression, also right to life, right against arbitrary arrest and detention, right against torture. Some of the very hard stuff, typical human rights that we have identified. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I know you cannot see this, but I suggest you flip through the guide if you're interested. On the left-hand column, it guides the company in terms of what kinds of things they have to, the hoops that they have to jump to understand whether there are sanctions, embargoes, export controls that they have to look at. in terms of their due diligence, and also to understand whether their products are going to somewhat safe countries or not. And depending on that, moving to the right column to understand the products, what they do, and the potential different kinds of human rights impacts. And it has one specific case study in there involving Gamma International, which actually exported some cybersecurity products to Bahrain, which allegedly resulted in certain activists being detained and tortured. And actually this complaint went to the OECD grievance mechanism, and the UK contact point, national contact point, came up with its decision last year, basically condemning Gamma International's practice. So actually there is a concrete case in which these scenarios are examined. Next slide, please. So human rights impact assessment is one very specific way to understand human rights impacts of a company's operation. Case study is another way of just understanding what is happening, what are companies doing when they're faced with dilemmas. And under the banner of digital dangers, my organization has several case studies, one of which is to look at Ericsson's practice as telecoms vendor and to understand their due diligence process to figure out what countries and what kinds of conditions, if any, to impose on the sale of their products. Again, I won't go into a great level of detail at all, but right there are 5 copies of this particular case study if you're interested in flipping through. So having done the work with Tech UK, with Ericsson, when we were approached by a financial institution that wanted to understand how to make a decision on whether to lend or to provide guarantees in connection with export of network systems, we came up with this risk assessment framework that involves 4 Ps to look at purpose, place, product, and purchasers, to understand different kinds of risks involved in those domains, and to advise the financial institution on how to make their decisions go or no go. So if some of these Ps are triggered, perhaps the conversation about the particular deal should be elevated at the management level. And if all the 4 Ps are triggered and there are no mitigation measures, then perhaps the financial institution should consider not going forward with that particular transaction. So this is just a way to illustrate the key theme being network vendors, but how different human rights risks could be incorporated into various organizations' decision-making. Next slides, please. So now I'm going to change a little bit and talk about our engagement with ICANN, which we've been very happy to do in association with Article 19. And we have our leader, Niels, sitting in the room. So this is the way I understand the current engagement with ICANN. I think that there are 2 streams of inquiry going on in connection with ICANN's relationship with human rights. And one is a sort of very legalistic, normative, top-down approach. Another one, more impact-specific and ground-up approach, both triggered in connection with ICANN's IANA transition and the efforts to basically strengthen ICANN's accountability vis-a-vis its stakeholder groups. And I just think both of these are absolutely fascinating. So at the normative level, you might be aware that there was a decision to amend ICANN's bylaws, including a decision to include a human rights statement. And that reads, ICANN will commit to respect internationally recognized human rights as required by applicable law. Sounds like something that got drafted by a bunch of lawyers, and it is. So now the challenge is to figure out what does it mean then to ICANN's operations. So there is a process of trying to understand how the bylaws should be interpreted. So the idea is to come up with a frame of interpretation of that particular bylaw. So there's a bunch of people trying to define what that means, and I'll show you the next diagram in terms of what specific human rights that are being addressed. But one of the conversations we're having there is, do the UN guiding principles actually apply to ICANN, given that ICANN is a California nonprofit? And so is that really relevant? Well, yes, on the one hand, because ICANN is set up like a business, and it does actually have a huge influence on business, particularly cyber commerce. On the other hand, ICANN is technically not a business itself. And so how do we square this circle? We're having a lot of conversations around that. And now moving to the bottom. So again, we are also trying to understand ICANN's operations and its human rights impacts from a very impact-specific point of view. And so the instrument that we're using there is a human rights impact assessment process to understand both ICANN's impacts as a owner of property, physical property, and employer of people. So there is a specific human rights footprint, as we call it, physical human rights that are violations, potentially, that we might identify. But the bulk of the interesting human rights impacts will come from ICANN's application of its policies. And so those are the various domains of conversations that are occurring within ICANN. And the next slide, please. So I'm sorry, again, you're not going to be able to read this. But if you go to the ICANN website, you'll see this particular visualization of rights. And I just think it's very elegantly done. So on the left-hand column, there are various rights that have been identified as being relevant to ICANN: right to privacy, freedom of association, expression. Also here, ICANN identified economic, social, and cultural rights as being relevant, as well as a bunch of human rights principles. So these are rule of law. This is about participation and consultation, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination. And in the middle, those are the various attributes that you could associate with these rights. And towards the right-hand side are the various ICANN policies that could trigger these human rights. So this is still work in progress, and even this might change, but I thought this might be something that you might want to refer to within your conversation. And so now I just have a few remaining slides specifically on your LGBTI conversation. So actually, Lisa, if you could skip this one and go to the next one. So first and foremost, this is an issue that a lot of companies are grappling with, because being able to hire talented employees and being able to retain them also means being very conscious of how they treat LGBTI employees. And as a result, there's a lot of interest expressed from the business community. And as a result, in collaboration with the UN Human Rights Office, we are in a process of doing a global consultation on a set of principles that businesses can use to put in place a policy and set of procedures addressing LGBTI issues in their operations. Again, I won't go into the details, but if you look at the bottom, there are 3 contact names. The last one, Salil Tripathi, is our contact point. Working on this particular project. If you have a lot of questions about that, please do feel free to reach out to him or to me. The next slide, please. And I just wanted to highlight one thing coming out of a discussion paper that's circulating, which I cannot unfortunately circulate because it's not in the public domain because of the sensitivity issues associated with it, particularly because there are 73 jurisdictions in the world that makes being LGBTI person illegal in various ways. But Elisa has a discussion paper, And also, if you're interested in, I'm happy to distribute it to you on a personal basis. But this is just a frame that a company could use to understand when it's making its decision on where to go for their operations, how to think about their operations. So there are three models. The first one being when in Rome, behave like the Romans. So this means, you know, if you have an office in country X that might be hostile to LGBTI staff, people, then basically adapt to local conditions, and give your workers a way to opt out from being posted to that particular country. And this is a compromise situation, but this might lead to eventually the next model, which is an embassy model, which means your corporate policy could be enforced in all the different jurisdictions in which you have business, regardless of the national law, by creating a safe space within your quote-unquote embassy. And this could help promote tolerance within local staff and may have other spillover effects. And the last model being an advocacy model, where you just go and push as much as possible local regulations so that they change. And this will have benefit not just to your local staff, but other stakeholders within the country as well. So this is one decision-making framework that we're thinking about pushing through the eventual principles. And the last slide, please. And just to comment finally on your meeting venue decision-making process, I thought it might be useful to just show you how human rights organizations and others, organizations that deal with thematic human rights, how they make their decisions in terms of selection of venue from a human rights perspective. And so here are just sort of some random considerations that you might want to think about. And these organizations have all the same dilemmas that you do. Yeah. So they think about whether going to a particular country and having an annual meeting, whether that all of a sudden legitimatize what that country is doing in terms of human rights, or whether that expresses solidarity with the stakeholders who are active in that particular country. So it's a balancing act. There's no black or white way of making this decision. But first of all, to generally understand the background of the country, its human rights track record, you can do this through looking at different kinds of databases, the State Department, Freedom House, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe more importantly, to understand a visible pattern of human rights abuse in that particular country vis-a-vis a right or a series of rights that are most relevant to the organization's mission and values. Right? So I read that inclusiveness is a very important value for this organization. Well, if that's so, how does it mean in terms of your decision-making process? Maybe that's something that you want to think about. Also, the views of the local peers and NGOs. Would going there make it worse for them or actually better for them? So understanding what they are saying from the ground up, I think is very important. Another way to think about it is, what kinds of association would you have with the government? So would the government somehow subsidize the meeting? Would it give a free use of facilities? Would it provide some hospitalities, travel subsidies, and so on and so forth? Would they come and address the meeting? These are all considerations that you might want to think about. And finally, but last but not least, the specific safety threats or restrictions to some or all members and also the stakeholders. This to me is a very important human rights concept. So with that, I'm going to finish. I know I threw a lot of different things at you, but I hope it was helpful to just give you a glimpse of the fact that other organizations of all sorts of different kinds grapple with these issues, not always necessarily with straightforward answers. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So we have time for Q&A. We have 15 minutes left, and that's the rest of the agenda. So we have our two speakers who would be happy to field questions or if people have comments, now is the time. So you guys can come back up too, and here we have another mic. So
Randall Gallons, I had a question on that. One of the most recent slides, one of the last ones, there's a on the list of random considerations about whether going would help or hurt. I was just kind of curious, how would one go about trying to decide that?
Matogo, do you want to? You can both come up, and then whoever they're addressed. So yeah. Yeah.
So I'll be just very straightforward. I think consulting your local stakeholders and NGOs who are active might be one very quick way to address that particular question.
Are there, so we have some, and it depends on the place, we have something you could call local stakeholders, but when you say NGOs, can you elaborate on what you mean? Like other organizations of a similar ilk to ours, or organizations that deal with the issue directly?
It's probably both.
Okay, thank you.
Ted Hurdy, and luckily the question I had was also on this slide, handy that. One of the things that's interesting about the IETF as an organization is that it has no members. It has participants, and the participants have various levels of participation, which may include coming to physical meetings or may not. And one of our questions as we go through this, should we go to a venue or not, has commonly been around what does it do to enable or restrict participation. But because we do not have a defined membership, it's been very difficult for us to assess this question. And many of the people who've discussed this issue, both in this terms and in kind of broader terms of freedom of association, or freedom of participation more exactly, have talked about the economic costs of participation in various venues. And I was wondering if you could kind of explore with us, given that we have no defined membership, how we would conduct such an assessment.
So first of all, so I stand corrected that you don't have members, but there is probably a way to poll people who frequently come to your meetings. And so I think there are various mechanisms that you could use to assess what your participants or would-be participants are saying, as well as, so I guess what I'm saying is I would promote a very consultative approach to this, which is the nature of your organization in any event.
Hi, I'm Ludovice van der Laan. I'm a recovering politician, but I currently serve on the ICANN board. I've had to deal with situations like this, so I just wanted to give a couple of examples of how I did that in my previous board role as Vice President of the European Liberal Democrats. Now, the first thing is that we clearly chose to be to have the advocacy approach because we were politicians and we think our job is changing the world. So what I would do is if I, for example, went to Armenia, I would contact the local LGBT organizations. There were two. Usually competing ones, and ask, is it useful if we do something with you? And one of them said, yes, please, can you invite us to your session so that we can say something about the situation, just to make a statement. And the other one said, actually, could you come visit our local gay bar? Because that would make a huge impact, because we were recently firebombed, and the fact that politicians actually enter the gay bar means we won't be firebombed and we might actually get some police protection. So there were different approaches, and we honored them both. We had a meeting last year in Budapest because we were deeply concerned about the human rights situation there. We chose explicitly to go there precisely because there was a problem, and we were able to give a platform to opposition people. But at the same time, we also invited government people so that, kind of to expose them, because things are never black and white. Not everyone in the government is evil, and not everyone in the opposition or on the human rights arena is a saint. So it's, I think, to try to listen to all sides and to have views and to make statements is really important as well. And I was thinking, I mean, obviously, this is my first IETF, sorry. And, but I was thinking one of the simple things that if you do guys, if IETF decides to go to Singapore, have a cool t-shirt with a rainbow flag on it to show if you stand for diversity. I mean, there's really small things you could already do to show where you stand if you want it to be an inclusive kind of meeting. So that's just from my experience.
Thanks.
Charles, I have various kinds of experiences working in interesting places. So you have things like how far do you push the advocacy? And the question of, who are you helping by going or helping by not going? It depends very much on what you do when you are there, right? So exactly as you just said, if you are going and supporting human rights and being clear about that, it's very different from if you are going and becoming a propaganda tool for whoever it is who is not supporting human rights, who is attacking human rights. The outcome is what actually matters. The question I wanted to put, because again, IETF is not an organization with a defined membership, is what do you do when you have rights in conflict? So I personally believe that there is a human right to whatever kind of sexuality and gender you want, and I personally believe that there is a human right to absolute freedom of religion, which essentially implies the right to be what I would call an antediluvian bigot, a racist, bigoted, homophobic person has a right to hold their opinions. And where we get into conflict is where people's opinions, privately held, are actually put under pressure. There's a clear historic example for those who follow Mozilla of this playing out in practice. How should we handle that kind of conflict? Where can we think about how to say this is people's opinion which they have the right to hold and to express, and this is hate speech and oppression, one of the things for which I don't think there is a right?
That's a very good question, also a very difficult question. This often comes up indeed in terms of having multiple rights out there, and how do you balance different rights, how do you deal with different rights and make conflict with each other. And I can't give a cookie cutter answer to that. I can say that in terms of how human rights have been considered from human rights practitioners' standpoint, but also in terms of how human rights have been formulated, is that they should be indivisible, meaning there cannot be a situation where we say we will go at the expense of one human right to favor another one, which means that in practice there will always be a difficult, I don't want to say balancing act, but a difficult act, a difficult assessment, a difficult implementation to ensure that all rights can be respected. And in the technical, let's say in the technology community, oftentimes the balance between privacy and security comes up. You bring up the example of freedom of expression, freedom of religion. There is an obligation, I believe, on states at least, and corporations have responsibility to respect in that sense, that all rights can be respected in such a way.
And just to elaborate further, there are rules within the human rights doctrine that would say certain rights can be restricted by governments under certain circumstances and subject to law, right? And there are certain things that are absolutely sacrosanct. So the right to privacy could be moderated by a government depending on particular circumstances, subject to law, versus right to be free from torture, arbitrary detention, etc. Those are absolute. And so there are these rules, but I think in terms of the actual day-to-day decision-making process, it's a balancing act and it's a judgment call. but it's something that should be socialized within an organization, right? So that everybody can explain why and how.
Jari Arko. I'm a recovering amateur meeting organizer, among a few other things. And
Covering.
it takes a lot of recovery, actually. So thank you for the presentation. I really like them. I did have a question on, you had this different modes of going to a particular place, compromise or the embassy mode. And I wanted to ask about the embassy mode and the safe space. And could you give some examples of that? Are you thinking more in terms of like positive action, that even though laws in this place don't require us to treat everybody equally, we in this company or organization do? Or are you thinking more in terms of protecting the population of your organization from outside influence? There might be some things that are illegal, for instance, in a country. So if you could give us some examples that would help me understand better what kinds of things we could do.
Sure. So, for example, providing benefits to LGBTI couples that are not legally required, for example, convening a space within a particular office for LGBTI employees to come together and talk about these issues freely. These are some very concrete examples of what companies can do within its own four walls. So that's what it's talking about. Within the embassy compound, there are certain things that they can do despite the local law. And that's a very different thing from just adapting to local law and say, that's all we do. We don't provide anything over and above. That's the difference.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming here and chatting with us. I'm Dave Crocker. I've been on the continent for more than a week, so I'm pretty sure I'm not recovering from anything. I suspect this discussion needs to make a pretty strong distinction between how the IETF conducts its business versus what sorts of political or social, I'll call it advocacy, or actions it might take, primarily through showing up somewhere. Internally, we have a pretty simple model. The execution of it isn't so simple, but the model is we're open to everybody. Show up, participate, end of discussion, or beginning of discussion. The practice of that has all sorts of difficulties. We have a history of coming out of a white male engineering American culture and reflect that in many ways. That's been a subject of discussion in recent years. But the formal model we have is really quite straightforward. The challenge we've run into is one of choosing where to show up. And pretty much everywhere in the world has some controversy associated with it. So we get to choose, sometimes unwittingly, particular issues in particular places. My own view is that as a rule, we should choose not to be advocates on social issues as an organization. We should keep to our knitting, stick to our knitting of being as inclusive as we are physically capable of being. And the challenge here on the question of where to show up is some places are sufficiently egregious that we agree among ourselves that we don't want to show up there. And the trouble is there's a lot of places that are pretty egregious that we still show up at. So what were you going to say? Well, pretty much all. Well, since everywhere has some controversy, some of us we are each of us certain to live somewhere with controversy. We show up in places that are pretty offensive for some of the participants.
We have 1 minute left. Just FYI, we have 1 minute left. So,
okay. So we don't have any means of figuring out where to show up other than spontaneous reactions. Guidance that helps us figure that out actually could be quite helpful.
Charles, again, I wanted to address that last question of how do you create safe spaces? So I'd appreciate enlightenment. I think I work in a company based in Russia, and Russia has a bunch of law about making it illegal to promote homosexuality or non-traditional families. Our company has a policy which is to ensure that you do not discriminate against people based on sexuality or various other questions. And the company is quite clear in reminding its employees from time to time that that's our policy. One of the things that comes into the go and no-go question is, it's one thing to go to a country where it is legal to discriminate against people because they have blue eyes. It's a different thing to go to a country where it is illegal not to discriminate against people. So there's an important difference there. If what we do at work is viewed as promoting non-traditional family values, then it's illegal. And breaking the law is generally regarded as one of the things that companies shouldn't do. And that makes it a much more difficult place to go. If there is a place where the laws are, in theory, medieval, but the implementation is actually one that doesn't cause problems and one that allows us to behave in a manner we believe is acceptable, then that's a different level of question, a different level of controversy. Because as the last piece here, I live and come from and visit and work in places, all of which commit horrendous human rights violations. And unfortunately, that applies to most of the planet, so it's pretty hard to avoid.
Thanks. So we're over time. I know I didn't cut the cue before you got in it, but please make it brief so people can go to lunch.
Okay, so it was a question, so it will be an open question, I guess. But the question is, so there are a lot of human rights treaties, and so the question is, what would be a good method to understand which rights are relevant for this organization, and what methods could you suggest us for that, to understand that better, to make sure that we're not cherry picking? And next to that is, like, we can perhaps look at the participants that are here, but we cannot really question the participants that are not here that we might want to have here. So that also makes it a bit harder. And then finally is a question about attribution. So you talked about gamma and cybersecurity, but the IETF produces open voluntary standards. So the IETF is not the protocol police. So how does that relate, and how can their responsibility be taken up there? I would be very interested.
If you guys have super brief responses, and then we'll call it a day.
I think most of what you said are statements. Just very quickly, I don't think that your meeting venue decision-making is a total chaotic, spontaneous process. You have some criteria, and I think that what you're doing is to codify those criteria. So the question is, what else, or what differently, how differently you would like to do that in a conscious way as opposed to subconscious way, and I see that happening. And so this is just an input into your process. There's no a simple answer. You are not an LGBTI advocacy organization, right? You have an inclusiveness value as your part of the expression of who you are, but you're not an LGBTI organization. You could say that, okay, this is something that's nice to have, but it's not central to our decision-making process. But as an organization, we will look at some other criteria for our meeting decision, and I think that's perfectly fine, but you still need to address your members, your participants' concerns about, well, how are we going to deal with that? And so I think that, again, there's no necessarily a black or white way forward on this. This is a lot to do with socializing this particular topic inside your organization. Finally, Niels, I'm not going to answer all of your questions, but just to say how to avoid cherry picking. How do you know you have the comprehensive set of rights that you need to address? You could go about it that way. Yeah, you could have a very thorough analysis of the legal instruments and a very thorough analysis of your impacts and marry the two and come up with a strategy. That's one thing, one way of doing this. You could say, we're going to pick on this particular right because everybody agrees that this is something that we need to focus on, say right to privacy. And we're just going to really, really, really get down to the basics and to figure out what that means to our organization, right? This is another way of figuring out your human rights strategy. So I don't think it's just, the most thorough academic comprehensive approach is necessarily your answer. Thanks.
Thanks. So just to add to that, I think Toko's points were all very good and very clear. To just answer your question in terms of how to get an understanding of how human rights issues take a different role in different places, I would say there are different assessments ongoing by different organizations, such as Human Rights Watch, such as Freedom House, that look at different situations, different countries to give a proper situation sketch of the current concerns on human rights. So that is maybe something to keep in mind, and maybe very practically as to the question of how to get input from people who are not present in the room as to what concerns they have. I would amplify what Mutoko said earlier about polling, surveying participants online through different means to get just some sort of input about generally what kind of factors are at play for you that would enable or hinder your participation in in-person meetings. And I think those pieces of information can be very valuable, and mapping those out vis-a-vis the concerns of human rights that we've seen and that we read about in different countries, I think can be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Really excellent. Enjoy your lunch. Oh, I'm not coming. I'm sorry. I should have said one way or the other, but yeah, Adam was like, you don't have to come, and I was like, yeah, I've got 6 other things to do. So. Thanks for checking.